This presentation is about 7 industry giants inducted into the AADE Drilling Fluids Hall of Fame, class of 2010. The honorees tell their stories in their own words, based on interviews conducted in April and June of that year. Preston Moore was unable to attend the ceremony. Dorothy Carney accepted for Leroy Carney. Here are the honorees with their citations in alphabetical order. Max Annis, for his contributions to drilling fluids technology, their performance under extreme conditions, and their impact on the environment. Leroy Carney, for his research and development of high-performance drilling fluids and fundamental work on complex chemical interactions. Mr. Carney passed away in 1997. Jack Estes, for his accomplishments in optimized drilling fluids technology, and standardization. Preston Moore, for his dedication to drilling engineering education and to the drilling man on the rig. George Ormsby, for his fundamental work on mechanical solid separation, hydraulics, and downhole pressure analyses of drilling fluids. Mr. Ormsby passed away in May 2011 at the age of 92. William Ream, for his contributions to directional drilling operations and to the understanding of wellbore pressures. And George Savins, for his development of the VG meter and his contributions to the understanding of the rheology of complex fluids. The Drilling Fluids Hall of Fame was established in 2006 by the AADE Houston chapter to recognize key individuals who have made significant contributions to drilling and completion fluids and to elevate our image in the petroleum industry. 8 Hall of Famers from the classes of 2006 and 2008 attended the induction ceremony to welcome the new honorees and to celebrate their biannual reunion. The class of 2010 was recognized during a luncheon ceremony at the Fluids Technology Conference held in Houston. Dennis Goldwood, Selection Committee Chairman, had the distinct honor of inducting the new Hall of Famers. Afterwards, the honorees joined other conference attendees and students to enjoy a reception in the exhibition area. A highlight of the event was the Wii bowling competition sponsored by the AADE Next group.
It's about half divided between research and half operations, and the research half was divided between a major operating research and a major drilling fluids company research.
His mind worked like a machine when it came to the problems. If an engineer called him with a problem, you could see little wheels rolling around in his head, you know, the cogs meshing together to make the answer come out.
If you're assigned to a rig, you're going to learn that you don't know it all. You haven't got it all knowed up. You learn something and you change. Well, all these changes on every rig being drilled ends up changing industry standards.
My teaching style was, I tried to enjoy myself and I wanted the class to enjoy it. I didn't want to be dull. And so I would, as you may remember, I would stand up on the table and I would throw erasers at people that were asleep, and I would tend to pull out my shirt tail and cry when somebody would come up with a bad answer.
I've had a good time because learning things is fun. And when you learn something and learn to use it, it's amazing how people are anxious to talk to you because most people don't know how to use these things.
But this has been the great dominating thing that's been hanging over my head for 50 years in the oil field, is what's angular friction and how does it work and what does it mean And what can we do to control it?
And you know what my greatest reward is to this day? It's for me to be able to walk into a mud lab 60 years later, walk to the lab bench and see sitting there all alone a cruddy, tired looking viscometer, but still working, with a nameplate on it, with an inscription that is barely legible, and it says, license under U.S. patent number 2703006.
He was born in Amite, Louisiana. He grew up in Amite, went to high school there, went to college in southeastern Louisiana, and that's in Hammond, just down the road from Amite. He was the only one in his family of that generation that graduated from college. He died December the 10th, 1997. It was in the morning, and he was actually sitting on an airplane ready to go somewhere.
I grew up in the Chicago area, and I really never liked big cities. So when I went in the Army, got out of the Army after Korea, well, I went back to the Rocky Mountains. Unfortunately, in ensuing years, people kept sending the paycheck to Houston.
I grew up in a little farming community called Atwood, Oklahoma. I graduated in 1942, and at that time I was deferred from the service because of farming, and I had a 2C deferment, which was for the duration of the war. But I did not want to stay on the farm, so I went over and volunteered for the Navy.
I grew up in northwestern Oklahoma, near a little town of Freedom. Went to high school there, and then went on to the University of Oklahoma from there, and got my degree in engineering physics.
So I was born in Rogers, Arkansas, and grew up there till we moved to Houston. We were transferred back to Tulsa, and that's where I grew up. I won a four-year scholarship to Methodist University to become a preacher, but I was supposed to take pre-med, so I went to the University of Tulsa. Decided after a year I didn't want to be around sick people, and turned over to the College of Petroleum Engineering.
My father was in the military. He had served in World War I, and eventually in World War II, like I did.
He was opening up the South American region for Pioneer Centrifuge Company, and I came in May, and we married the same day in New Orleans. He picked me up from the ship, and it has been 50 years, and it was okay, wasn't it? Interesting life.
My father, being the supply sergeant for the medical department, had access to all kinds of nice things for chemistry sets. Retorts, distillation columns, potassium chloride, potassium nitrate, sulfur, charcoal, made lots of exploding things.
He had just gotten out of the Army in the 50s, made a trip over here and did an interview with Magabar. And they hired him.
On December the 7th, I was an altar boy, and I was serving Mass for the Catholic chaplain at Schofield Barracks. At 7:55 a.m., all hell broke loose. One of the planes turned, and the sun shone on it, the silhouette on its wings, and there was the red ball.
When I was in the service, I was an electronic nuclear weapons fusing system specialist.
This company came to town that I'd never heard of, named Humble Oil Refining Company. I went on to Houston then, and they placed me in research. After a year, I was called into the Air Force and reported to the Air Force Special Weapons Center in Albuquerque.
And I'm in the process of writing a book on my years in the war. I was in the invasion of Iwo Jima, in the first wave of boats to hit Blue Beach #2. Two of our boats were blown up going in, and we were the only boat to pull off the beach. And then I was in the invasion of Okinawa.
I graduated in '43 from Martin High School, and then was drafted and started at A&M in June. Then was drafted in December of '43. Went into the service.
I got out of the Navy in May of 1946, and at that time started to school at East Central State Teachers College, and was going to major in mathematics because math teachers could get jobs.
I graduated from Missouri School of Mines, and as I said, I went into the Army. Then Korea was at the time they requested my presence. Came back and bummed around the oil field for a couple of years until I started with Magabar. And I was in the first mud class that had the new fan VG meter, the 4-speed VG meter. This was a fantastic thing.
And even in India, there was a Russian who recognized him through a picture in a magazine. And in the Sahara Desert one time, somebody said, I have seen this guy and I have read every article he ever wrote. So he was known. Yeah. And young people always flocked to him, but thought that his schools were too intense. And he said, yeah, you come in the mornings and you learn and you sit here and you just, it's too intense, why can't we have it 2 weeks? And we started with 3 days and then extended it to 2 weeks. And all the young engineers were complaining, and George would say, look at the old tool pusher. He can sit 8 hours here and take it, and you young people take it too. Yep.
I majored in petroleum engineering and got a bachelor's degree in 1949 from the University of Oklahoma in August 1949. I was offered a job by Humble Oil and Refining Company. There were 3 of us that were offered jobs. It was kind of hard to get a job in those days. And I went to work for Humble in Houston and worked out in the field as a roughneck.
We met when we were both working for IMCO. That was back before Halliburton bought IMCO. We got married, then about a year later we had our first child, and I was in the hospital with the baby when he came and said, Halliburton wants us to go up to Duncan, Oklahoma. We were up there for about 4 years.
In June of '49, I graduated. I was immediately hired by Magnolia, which was a subsidiary of Saucony Vacuum Oil Company of New York, and was assigned to the drilling fluids group in the production division of what was then called the Field Research Laboratory, or FRL, which was in Duncanville, Texas, just outside of Dallas.
And so after about 10 years in Magabar, I ended up in probably what is the most critical or powerful job in the company at that time, which was regional engineer. And I was regional engineer in South Louisiana.
My first assignment was to learn everything I could about drilling fluids and how to improve them.
So we decided we would go out on our own. And first off, our first step was to form our own little company, and that was Carney Mudd Consultants.
I think the first assignment when I showed up back at Exxon is that we need a drilling fluids manual.
We had a problem come up. The manager, who was Jim McLaurin at the time, said, well, this company down here who claims to be killing wells says that our mud engineers are boiler pausing their readings because the yield points are not coming out to what they should be. And so he said, now whatever the problem is, I don't know, but fix it.
Trying to learn everything I could about this weird subject called rheology. And 2 years later, I got my first break, which was in my first project. And if I had not had all of that great support and enthusiasm from my colleagues, I don't know how I would have done it.
So I had been to a lecture by a fellow by the name of Frank Preby with City Service Oil Company. And he was talking about this new paper out by Goins and O'Brien on how to kill wells. Well, this is what our problem was. These people with some big tanks were killing wells and claiming that they were doing it with an annular pressure calculation. Well, they obviously weren't, but it wasn't apparent at the time.
I spent nearly half my career in research, for the first 17 years, and the first 12 of that was with Humble Production Research. And at that point, I moved to Magabar and went over there as a technical advisor, and ended up actually getting into training quite a bit.
As a solution to that, why I read up on the material and talked to Goins and O'Brien and talked to this fellow Preby, and wrote a series of 12 lessons for the mud engineers in South Louisiana about how to kill wells. Now you got to understand, at this time nobody had ever killed a well. This is the way we said we ought to do it.
Newport came along and they decided they wanted the company that we had built. It was concentrated mud chemicals. So we sold that to them. Everybody was happy. And we then had our own pocket money. We decided to do our own thing all by ourselves. That's when we did Kearney Oilfield Chemicals.
After a total of 5 years, it seemed like to me a good point. It was a decision point that I came to. I had a good offer, one I really figured I couldn't refuse, to go back to Exxon. And there were a lot of good reasons for doing it. And instead of going back to research, I could go back to operations, where I really wanted to go to start with.
But I started in '52 on this project, and within a year I had constructed a design for a prototype for a new viscometer, which obviously had some advantages over the current fan viscometer, which was a weight-driven apparatus. Then we disclosed the details of the design to Jimmy Fenn.
Just as luck would have it, Exxon came and kind of snuck in the back door and said, "Hey, can we interest you in selling to us?"
I stayed in drilling then until I left the company in 1958. During the time that I was with them, we cut the drilling time for 12,000 feet in the Gulf Coast from 60 days to 6 days. We, I saved $14 million on drilling operations in West Texas. I wrote the first drilling manual for the Humble Oil and Refining Company.
What I'm interested in, are you developing technology that the rest of us can use? He so went down and signed secrecy agreements and contracts to farm you guys out to 5 of the world's leading contractors. Art Park, Bill Randall, and myself. And that was very fortunate, because I got assigned to the engineering teams of the Green, the Easley, the E.R. Baden, the Miller, the Esley, and the Bertha Rogers. All drilled below 28,000 feet.
I had a fellow call in one night and say, "Hey, we got this well kick, and it was the 23rd, coming on to Christmas," and he said, "You know, we're going to be here forever. Can we kill this well with this lesson? Would you give me permission to kill this well with this lesson?" Well, very engineer-minded, with permission to do anything. And we didn't have any lawyers with the company at that time, so I said, "Okay, no, go do it." And so anyhow, he went, and as luck would have it, it was a small saltwater flow, so it all killed out in one circulation perfectly according to the book. And he was a big hero, and the first thing he did was tell every other mud engineer with Magabar in South Louisiana that this stuff worked fabulous. And so within the next 2 or 3 weeks, we killed 4 or 5 wells. Magabar then got to be known as the people that could kill wells.
He was always traveling, going to different places. You know, he went behind the Iron Curtain and South America, Europe, London, wherever. And he would come back and tell me all these things. I didn't get to go.
But I finally got a master's degree from the University of Houston going to night school. And at that time, I was offered the job again from the University of Oklahoma. And I took the job then.
How important was the mud engineer all of a sudden if he was the only man in all this area that knew how to kill a well kick? I mean, he was important.
Problem with solving problems was to identify the problem. And so often we didn't identify the problem, we identified parts that were involved but didn't solve the problem.
37 and a half years, from 1949 to January the 1st of 1985. That's when I officially retired. Within a week or so of that, Ken Gray, he had the Center for Earth Sciences at the Balcones Research Center in the University of Texas, called me and said, "George, would you like to come aboard? I want to start a program on inverted oil-based spuds." I said, "Well, sure, I'll come around." I said, "I may have to turn my ring around when I come down there, but I'll give it a try." I then moved on. Shinnerbed asked me to come aboard, Martin asked me to come aboard and spent some time with the graduate students there. And I got involved in dynamic oscillatory shear experiments with drilling fluids.
I had started on Committee 13 back with Exxon, and then carried on through Magabar. And then after 5 years there and going back, well, I picked it up there again.
The API, I became the voting representative for Standard Oil of Indiana on API Committee 13. We had Dwayne Anderson was our chemist and 2 technicians. I went over and got Tom Yehan with Forex Schlumberger and Dr. Peter Lundy, and I formed a European committee, starting with Oil Company Materials Association.
First consulting company that we formed with Grace Sherson and Moore.
They put me in on a job studying differential pressure sticking. So that's kind of how I fumbled around and got into that part of the industry. So I developed a portable device, which was, somebody called it the stickometer sometime after that.
I happened to be in a conference in Lafayette where a fellow from Schlumberger said, the short normal, the 16-inch short normal tends to follow the pressure curve. Well, I had no idea why it followed the curve. I didn't even know what a 16-inch short normal was at the time. Sure enough, the plot followed the pressure. So since we had this correspondence lesson going, when we got through the 12, we just added a little bit on well log interpretation. And lo and behold, again, we had a burst of luck because one of the boys who later was a staff engineer, Rene Herbert, called me one night from out offshore, and he says, "Well, we're drilling very, very slow. Can I cut this mud weight back 4 pounds?" I told Rene, "Well, hey, go do it. Go do it." So he did it, and it took off drilling. Now, cut mud weight 4 pounds, 12,000 foot well, come on, guys. But we didn't know any better.
We pay you around here for innovation, and nobody in my group knows anything about computers. You got the necessary chemistry. And so that's how I got hired in at Stanlin Oil and Gas.
Well, of course, immediately Rene told everybody else in the district to get hold of those red logs and read them, and off we go. And so from that we went on to the D exponent, and we went on to pressures from temperatures and pressures from this and pressures from that. And it was a really fun time because we had a free hand to do all of these things, and they were so new.
And I was told to learn everything I could about coal. In particular, the underground gasification of coal. Spent 4 years in there, and it turned out to be pretty good. I earned 5 or 6 patents out of that work. I really enjoyed it.
And as mud engineers, all of a sudden we were important people. Instead of being that guy.
Well, part of the training, very naturally in drilling fluids, really has to go to a mud lab. I found, that I can talk to people and maybe give them a bunch of facts, and it lasts them until they get to the door, if that long.
I thought the secret to successful drilling was the mud you used.
They sent me all over the world to salvage wells out of trouble, from the Yukon Northwest Territory to the Terra del Fuego to the Gulf of Suez to even drilling in the Sedco 450, 1,300 feet of water in the Andaman Sea, everywhere.
I got Jim Fan over. It sold him enough that he went back to the drawing board, and we cooperated then on a development of a machine called the Fan 50 eventually.
After about 20 years, in fact, after about 20 years exactly with Magabar, I quit and went out on my own because there were getting to be so many things we couldn't do anymore.
I remember Preston Moore one time, he made a big point of this. He says, you have seen the industry from the three directions that are most prominent, that most people only see this industry from one direction.
I always talked to him because he always enjoyed staying in step with things or ahead of things. And the more he knew about what was going on out in the field, the more he knew about what he needed to develop in the laboratory.
My favorite of all the things in drilling was drilling mud. I thought that everybody was using drilling mud wrong.
It's partly your fault because you're out there selling drilling mud. What we learned in the early days when we didn't try selling mud, we tried to sell well control, we tried to sell pressure from well logs, and we tried to sell well planning and all of this stuff, that if you could sell all this other stuff, why the mud just went along with it.
And I have to say that those people in the days of the 70s, there was an innovative bunch, pioneers and full of ideas, and I hope that the systems and the methods they came up with to help the industry are still being applied.
But I had developed a effective mud and hydraulics on drilling rates. And I could put in the properties or whatever using something called Pickering technology. I was so proud of myself that the models worked clear to 30,000 feet.
Horizontal drilling sort of showed up in the Austin Chalk, and I talked them into making me project advisor for a horizontal drilling project. And the horizontal drilling project was, can we drill horizontally? And after 2 years, well, we sort of did.
The challenge led to innovation, and usually to developing a new product, which was in the entrepreneurial range. He followed it through.
Hughes Tool Company came out with these 1 1/4 inch microbits, so I built a microbit drilling machine, and I started drilling with different muds, and this is how I developed a drilling rate model for muds.
Got a mud engineer to go around with me and tell me what other people were doing. And if other people were doing better than us, then I did what they did. Too many people don't look at success and follow success. And I had a habit of doing that. My individual pride never kept me from copying something else.
I got into underbalance drilling for a while, and it was an interesting period, just like the first period in well control. Learning all these things. We'd go into a man's office and he'd say, "You are going to do what?"
He says, you cannot put the laboratory in the position of recommending manufacturing. You have to develop a bit code and then buy the bits and put them in a sack so nobody can see what they are. So this got published in the November 1971 issue of the Journal of Extreme Technology. The very next year, the API and the IADC adopted a version of that 3-digit code as the bit standard that is used to purchase bits to this day.
So Leroy developed this product of Lubriclean, and doesn't sound too outstanding, but at the OTC that year, there was a big fish tank out there at MCO's booth, and it was filled with Lubriclean, just Lubriclean, and it had fishes swimming in it. And when he came home that night, after this tank was set up out there, he came home and he was just absolutely electrified. He was telling me about it and he just couldn't stand still.
I decided to stay at the University of Oklahoma. And it turned out that that was probably the best move I ever made, because then I started teaching drilling practice at schools in different parts of the world, and I have taught drilling practice at schools in about 30 countries of the world, all in English.
He built. You would challenge him and he would build up. So he followed all the steps. Don't know whether you'd call him an innovator or an entrepreneur or what. He was all of them.
I've written basically 3 textbooks. One was early days on blowout control, which was well controlled. It's well received. And I've written one on managed pressure drilling. And I'm writing one on underbalance drilling. And the really good thing about a book is not what you tell other people. It's what you're forced to tell yourself.
I'll tell you a story about the Marsh funnel. I noticed that it took an hour or so to drill through all this after trips. Stuff had fallen in the hole. Man, I started putting bentonite extender in it. I ran that darn yield point up to about 50. The Marsh funnel went to about 90. Jim Ray called from Oklahoma City. He says that you're out of spec on the Marsh funnel. Yeah, but after a trip, we went right to bottom, saving several hours. Plus the hole was engaged. So when Chief Baytubby left, I went up between the first tank and the second tank, got the Marsh funnel and tossed it into the reserve pit.
I worked on the Bay of Campeche blowout, and then I worked for the government when they were trying to drill offshore up in Boston, and we won all of those lawsuits. In fact, in the period of time that I was working in lawsuits, I was only on the losing side of one lawsuit.
And I have to say I'm proud that you recognize the men of the time. They were giving their time to the industry.
He would be so proud today of having this honor bestowed on him.
And I'm very proud that he's being honored and being recognized at this point. So
I've been recognized for a lot of things, as you know, but I've never been recognized for mud, and drilling mud was my primary interest. I probably did more changing with drilling mud than I did with anything else, and it was my primary interest at the time. I was more a mud engineer than I was a drilling engineer through a lot of my life.
Just a couple of days ago, I said, I'm going to look it up on the dictionary. Mentor, a wise man with wisdom. And I said, that's those words to characterize Arthur Metzner. And it's funny the way we met. It so happened that there was an existence, and nobody ever knew this, there was something called the Monitor for the Naval Weapons Hydroballistics Division of the Department of the Navy. And they, somehow or other, became aware of the fact that George Savins and Arthur Metzner, 2 separate entities, that's all we knew, we just knew each other, knew each other, had programs that the word was active in drag reduction. A vehicle that they had simulated, a bow of a boat, which some are other drag less under seasonal conditions. You know what it was the algae were growing in the towing tank, exuding a polymer, high molecular biopolymer with drag reducing properties.
I never met a group on a drilling rig that didn't cooperate with me, and that's the truth. I never met a man in the field, a pusher or a drilling crew, that I couldn't get to cooperate with me.
In the early days of the mud, there was one of our present members still here, Leon Robinson. Dr. Leon Robinson worked for EPR. Right now, Leon is the nicest old guy you ever knew, and I love him, and we have dinner together. But in the early days, he was looking out after interests, Exxon's interests, and I was looking out after Magabar's interests, and they weren't always the same thing. Besides, Leon knew more than I did.
Leon Robinson was in research with Humble, and he helped me a lot because even then, when I was working with Humble, I listened to people. I listened to what they said. Leon was a very brilliant guy. He was a smart fella, and I listened to what he said.
In our meeting today, we had Max Annis, and he was another one like that, the oil company staff engineers that knew just enough to catch you when you weren't sure of what you were doing.
I don't think I probably ever worked with anybody that I didn't learn something. And I learned very quickly that I found myself in a group of people, the first group I worked with there, that were the most knowledgeable bunch of people that I'd ever seen. And, they put professors to shame.
Another really great teacher was Preston Moore at the University of Oklahoma. I'm sorry that he didn't come to this meeting today because he is sick, but he was one of the best teachers I have ever run into. He understood that to teach somebody you had to keep them awake, alive, and amused.
Preston Moore and I used to do company skills together, and I learned a lot from Preston, just watching him operate. And that was his technique of teaching, that he would get people fighting mad, but they wouldn't miss a thing then from then on, and they would remember it.
They were the people doing the work, and if we were going to get improvement in the field, they would be the people that had to do it. It wasn't going to be done out of Houston, and it wasn't going to be done out of New Orleans. It was going to be done by the people on the rigs.
Preston was teaching in Norman, Oklahoma, and he also taught overseas school. And George always, on an annual basis, would teach in Preston Moore School for a couple of days. And we saw each other annually, and also when we had schools, because after he left Pioneer Centrifuging Company, he opened up his own consulting firm, and we had our own schools.
One time a lawyer asked me a question, it was kind of funny. Asked me a question, and he said, I'm reading out of your book. He says, your book says this, and you read it? He said, is that what your book says? I said, I don't know. He said, well, I just read it out of your book. I said, well, you read something out of a book, but I don't know that that's what I wrote. And so they gave me the book. I said, if you'll let me have the book, I'll look at it. And when I did, I read the next two sentences, which clarified what I'd said in the other sentence. And I said, now you're not being fair to the jury. And we won that lawsuit as well.
Martin came to work there after I was there a while, and got started on oil muds, and he made this, which I think was probably one of the few breakthroughs in drilling fluids in my memory. It's one of those little spike things that you get, and that was the controlled activity feature.
I love to teach. I loved the lawsuits. I loved everything that I did in my life.
The story I like is that if I came to a bear and told him that I got to build a super bear, he would write a bit bigger bear with longer claws and bigger teeth. And that's the problem the drilling fluid industry has, is to do better, everybody thinks you need to do more and bigger. And the drilling fluid needs to break out of their drilling fluids and start looking at some of these other ideas.
I was a rebel in university. The SDS was active in those years, and I would take about 4 or 5 of my students, and we attended every SDS meeting, and I disrupted every one of them.
For the young people, I say constantly update your core skills. Be receptive to knowledge from your elders, you want to call them that. Knowledge transfer, wisdom. Incorporate all those things. And look forward to opportunities, if they should arise, to step out of the box and do something different.
And we don't have people that are just paid to sit and meditate on what they're doing. Are we doing this right? Is this really the way to do it?
I think that the people that have lived through the drilling industry have a lot to teach anybody.
If I had it all to do over, I don't think I would change a thing that I've done. I think I would live the life that I've lived.
I talked to a young engineer, and I have some graduate students working with me, and I try to get them at times to sit down and think, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Does it make any sense? Look at your solution. The solution works. Does the solution make any sense? And lots of times the answer is, well, no. It makes sense, but it just doesn't fit.
You can accomplish great things if you don't mind who gets the credit.
The off was the only place for me.
To the largest degree, it's what you make it. So I would say, first of all, is educate yourself and do it to the extent possible, and then don't ever stop doing that. Then you become a mentor and a teacher to others.
We have really done an excellent job of providing the technology and leading the world in industry standards.
The oil field has taught a lot of people drilling. They solved quite a few problems that had not been solved before.
I never considered doing anything but in the petroleum industry. I love the petroleum industry. I like all the people. I like the work.
Well, my message to you professionally is challenge, 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 challenge. Don't believe what people tell you. Find out if it's true. Challenge the beliefs. Are they all true? Well, we know they're not true. Challenge the beliefs that people have. Challenge your own beliefs. Challenge your company stories. And look at what you're doing and try to understand where it all fits into the game.